We set up a group within CIA. I spoke to Jim Comey, I spoke to Mike Rogers to make sure that they were able to send over their experts so that they could share information among them, even the most sensitive information that was not disseminated within the community. I wanted to make sure that, learning the lessons of 9/11, that there were not going to be any stovepipes and barriers to sharing information from the intelligence and law enforcement communities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Too much time, Mr. Byer. Mr. Gowdy, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you for your service to our country. Let's go back to where we were a couple of minutes ago. You mentioned, or you testified that you had a conversation in August of 2016 with your Russian counterpart. You testified that you briefed at least 8 members of Congress throughout the pendency of your investigation when you learned of Russian efforts. And we'll get to that in a minute, because my understanding from your unclassed report is Russia has historically attempted to interfere with our electoral process, and they did so without coordination, collusion, or conspiring with any of the candidates. So they have a history of doing it. We'll lay that aside for a minute. 2016 electoral process. When you learned of Russian efforts, did you have evidence of a connection between the Trump campaign and Russian state actors?
As I said, Mr. Gowdy, I don't do evidence. And we were uncovering information and intelligence about interactions and contacts between U.S. persons and the Russians. And as we came upon that, we would share it with the Bureau.
I appreciate that you don't do evidence, Director Brennan. Unfortunately, that's what I do. That's the word we use. You use the word assessment. You use the word tradecraft. I use the word evidence. And the good news for me is lots of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle use the word evidence too. One of my colleagues said there is more than circumstantial evidence of collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign. Now, there are only 2 types of evidence. There's circumstantial and direct. So if it's more than circumstantial, by necessity, it has to be direct. Those aren't my words. Those are the words of one of my colleagues on the other side of this very committee. Another Democrat colleague on the other side of this committee also used the word evidence, that he has seen evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And yet a third California Democrat said she had seen no evidence of collusion. So that's 3 different members of Congress from the same state using the same word, which is evidence. And that's the word that my fellow citizens understand, evidence. Assessment is your vernacular. Tradecraft is your vernacular. You and I both know what the word evidence means. And we're not getting into whether or not you corroborated, contradicted, examined, cross-examined. We're not getting into how you tested and probed the reliability of that evidence. It's a really simple question. Did evidence exist of collusion, coordination, conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russian state actors at the time you learned of 2016 efforts?
I encountered and am aware of information and intelligence that revealed contacts and interactions between Russian officials and U.S. persons involved in the Trump campaign that I was concerned about because of known Russian efforts to suborn such individuals. And it raised questions in my mind, again, whether or not the Russians were able to gain the cooperation of those individuals. I don't know whether or not such collusion, that's your term, such collusion existed. I don't know. But I know that there was a sufficient basis of information and intelligence that required further investigation by the Bureau to determine whether or not U.S. persons were actively conspiring, colluding with Russian officials.
Do you know the basis of that information that you share with the Bureau? I mean, what was the nature of the evidence?
I think, Mr. Gowdy, this committee has now been provided information that relates to that issue in terms of information that the agency shared with the Bureau. And that is something that is appropriately classified.
All right. And you learned that when? When in this chronology did you learn of the contacts between these official members of the Trump campaign, or because there's kind of a tripartite hierarchy. There's Trump himself, there are official members of the campaign, and then there are folks who represented themselves as being connected with him.
I'm not going to try to identify individuals nor try to parse it.
I don't want you to parse it. I just
last
want you
summer-
to identify the individuals. I don't want you
I'm
to
not
parse
going to
it.
identify the individuals because this is information that, again, is based on classified sources and intelligence.
Were
And I
they
think this committee
official
has access to
members
it.
of the campaign?
I'm going to defer to current agency officials to be able to further provide to you information related to that. But my understanding is that this committee has access to the documents that we would have provided to the Bureau.
All right. Last question, because I'm out of time. We can use the word evidence. We both know what the other one's talking about. How did you test, probe, examine, cross-examine, otherwise test the reliability or believability, credibility of that evidence you uncovered?
I made sure that the components within CIA that have responsible for counterintelligence, cyber, and Russia were actively working to understand as much as possible about the reliability, accuracy of the information that they already collected and the information that was available that needed further corroboration.
We'll come back to the next round.
Chairman's time expired. Mr. Himes, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Brennan, for being here. It's good to see you.
CIA to FBI to DOJ.
It was a direct conversation between the heads of government and state between two countries. I'm not going to respond to your.
Okay, but I think that's what we're I'm just, again, trying to get some understanding of what sets off a red flag. You know, and when do you refer to law enforcement? I know you weren't the director at that time, but boy, that just hits all the things you were talking about in the playbook. Elections, influential American, and building a relationship. I stand by you. So just, again, trying to get to the substance there. But that's interesting. You can't respond to a personal conversation, but this is what we're talking about. Anyway, with that, I yield back.
I try to get.
Go ahead.
I try to avoid getting involved in political issues, partisan issues, and so with respect to Mr. Winstrup, I just will not recognize that question.
Well, thank you. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Dr. Winstrup. Congressman Rooney and you were discussing generally the motive, and I think it is, let's just assume it's given that the Russians did not like Secretary Clinton, did not like President Obama for that matter, and desired negative things for her. But they also thought she was going to win. Was it your testimony that all of the information stolen was not publicly disseminated?
No, I said if they had collected additional information, as I think was implied, that the effort to try to further hurt her if she became president, that information, any type of derogatory information about her could have been husbanded for a post-election period.
All right. But do you know if negative information was husband, to use your word, and not disseminated?
Again, I think that would be inappropriate to talk about in an open session like this.
Is it inappropriate to both? I get not asking you about the nature of it. Is it inappropriate to answer yes or no whether or not that information was husband but not disseminated?
My request would be that we could talk about that in closed session.
Okay. I'll honor your request, and we'll talk about it in a little bit.
Chairman yields back. Mr. Castro, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Director Brennan, for your testimony here today. Over the course of the last several months, the intelligence agencies have been berated by the President for the possibility of leaks. Are you aware of his tweets and other criticisms he's made about leaking in the intelligence agencies?
I know that there have been a number of allegations made publicly about intelligence officials being responsible for those leaks. Yes, I'm aware of that.
Are you aware of a story that came out yesterday that said, quote, 3 White House staffers have been identified for leaking classified info. POTUS will fire, quote, multiple people when he returns to D.C.?
I'm unaware of that story or the facts, if any, underneath it.
If the story is true, and we don't know whether it is or not, but if it's true that there may have been people who leaked classified info at the White House, first, could you tell us, it seems like an obvious question, should be an obvious answer, are there people at the White House that would have classified information that they could leak to journalists?
White House officials, if they have the appropriate security clearances based on their position, they would have access to classified information, yes.
Okay. And then the second part of that is, if the White House has determined that leaks are coming from within their operation, could you tell us how they would go about determining that? How would they figure out that they have leakers in the White House?
If there is a sense that there are unauthorized